We're very pleased to have Mark Wright as our next speaker. Mark has as I've said before with our other speakers, has a wonderful bio that you should take a look at in your program guide. And I will turn the time over to Mark so that he has the most time possible. So, Mark Wright.
No problem. All right. Well, it's a pleasure to be here to talk today to talk about something that I've been trying to avoid for several years now. The geography question is not one that I really have. I feel bad saying it, but one that I've even really cared about. My PhD is more in socio-cultural issues of Mesoamerica, specifically the Classic Period Mayan civilization. And I don't think there's a single map anywhere in my dissertation. Geography is just not a question that's interested me a lot. And frankly, when it comes to Book of Mormon geography, it's kind of a messy and kind of an ugly endeavor, especially lately. The church, of course, has no official position on where events of the Book of Mormon took place. Nevertheless, there have been some heated debates about where the Book of Mormon happened. Currently, the most bitter divide, I guess, is between those who are proponents of the Mesoamerican theory and those who subscribe to the Heartland theory, where they think that the United States, kind of along the Mississippi River, is kind of the true setting. Now, despite what my perhaps inflammatory title may suggest, this paper is actually an attempt to synthesize some aspects of these two models as much as possible, and perhaps even try to build a bridge between the two camps. But as I was writing it, I realized the bridge is probably kind of like the one in Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, where it's rickety and then it gets cut off and everybody dies. But my basic thesis is this. The core locations and events detailed in the text of the Book of Mormon took place in Mesoamerica. But many Nephites and Lamanites migrated and established settlements far northward of the core area and are thus simply outside the scope of the text. I'm certainly not the first to make this argument or note the significance of this northward migration. But from countless conversations I've had about Book of Mormon geography in the past few years, I found that many people are unfamiliar with the idea. Just in this audience today, I can point to the work of John Sorensen, Brant Gardner, Matt Roper, Tyler Livingston, who is affiliated with FAIR. And I feel in some ways I'm doing little more than repackaging arguments that they've already made. And perhaps giving it a catchy name, which brings me to the catchy name. I'm going to call this the Hinterland hypothesis. The Hinterland hypothesis is essentially this. The term hinterland is used to refer to regions that are remote from urban areas. They are at the outer fringes or periphery of a core urban population. Large-scale migrations from the core out to periphery and beyond are not uncommon due to population pressures or other causes. In pre-Columbian Mesoamerica, for example, city-states often organized migrations to establish military garrisons or trading posts on the periphery of their domains. As Latter-day Saints, we of all people should understand the function of migrations, as our history and identity are largely defined by it, as anybody who went to a Pioneer Day picnic last week can attest. Movements from Kirtland to Nauvoo and the Exodus west. And as soon as the Saints were established in Salt Lake Valley, colonies began springing up in the hinterlands. In southern Utah, Nevada, California, even down in Chihuahua, Mexico. In the Book of Mormon, massive migrations were due to persistent Lamanite encroachment from the south, which caused Nephite populations to be perpetually driven northward. Beginning really from the time of the land of first inheritance, Nephi flees, goes up to Nephi, from Nephi to Zarahemla, from Zarahemla they get pushed out. It's just constant northward movement, and then ultimately up to Cumorah, and I think beyond. We'll talk about Cumorah in a little bit, by the way. One of the first to highlight the significance of the northward migration in the Book of Mormon was John E. Page, who had been one of the 12 apostles under Joseph Smith. In 1848, he noted, "All who are familiar with the Book of Mormon are probably aware of the fact that the whole account of the history of the forefathers of the American Indians, called the Nephites, Lamanites, and Zoramites, is confined to Central America entirely until the 394th page." Now, John Page is here referring to northward migrations discussed in Alma 63 that occurred in the 37th and 38th chapter I'm sorry, the 37th and 38th year of the reign of the judges, sometime around 55 BC. Alma 63 informs us that 5,400 men, and with their wives and their children, departed out of Zarahemla into the land which was northward. That's 5,400 men, plus their women, plus their children. That's 16 to 21,000 people. That's a big migration. At that same time, we have Hagoth building ships. Hagoth is not on the first couple of ships, by the way. He sends out a ship, he sends out another ship, he's building a third ship when the first ship comes back, and then he sends out a couple of more. A lot of movement going out. Also in that 38th year, it says there were many people who went forth into the land northward, apart from those already discussed earlier in the chapter. So the point is, Alma 63 describes an era of northward movement and migration sometime in the mid-1st century BC, away from the Nephite core area, and thus outside the scope of Nephite history. My argument is that these Nephite migrants continued to expand northward throughout the centuries, often due to Lamanite pressure from the south. During this expansion, both Nephites and Lamanites established settlements or colonies or outposts or whatever you want to call them. I believe every statement made by Joseph Smith or his contemporaries concerning Nephites or Lamanites in North America can be accommodated by this hinterland hypothesis. Now, to be clear, I'm not arguing for a return to the hemispheric model. Hemispheric models basically take specific named cities in the Book of Mormon and disperse them far and wide across the Americas. I'm very much a proponent of a more limited geography, and I believe the best available evidence places the core narrative of the Book of Mormon squarely in Mesoamerica. Now, to be frank, as to which specific Mesoamerican geography is correct, the Grijalva versus the Usumacinta, I don't know, and frankly, I don't care. But the preponderance of evidence always has and always will favor a Mesoamerican setting. And to the point where I feel like if I were even to talk about it here, it would be like beating a dead horse, or maybe a dead tapir. I don't know, whatever. What I am suggesting is that there were likely countless Nephites and Lamanite settlements spread across the continent, including within the so-called Hinterland, the so-called Heartland, whose history is not contained in the text of the Book of Mormon. They're simply external to the text. It doesn't make them any less Nephite or Lamanite. It just means their history is not recorded in that book. Now, prophets from Jacob to Moroni lamented the fact that they could only include less than 100th part of their proceedings. And so these northward migrants of the 1st century BC are simply part of that 99+% that are not recorded in the book. Out of sight, out of mind, as it were. I believe we do ourselves a disservice with an either-or mentality when it comes to issues of Book of Mormon geography. I'm afraid we're often guilty of playing what I call general authority chess. Elder so-and-so said this. Oh yeah, well, Elder President such-and-such said that, right? And we move around the chessboard never really checking each other or ending the game. To be clear, to the saints of Joseph Smith's day, any and all evidence from anywhere on the continent was deemed proof of the Book of Mormon. They did not distinguish between the evidence of North and South America. In fact, within a single editorial paragraph from the Times and Seasons in July 1842, the editor rejoices in both the North American evidence gleaned from Josiah Priest's American Antiquities, as well as in the Mesoamerican evidence put forth by John Lloyd Stevens and Frederick Catherwood in Incidents of Travel in Central America, Chiapas, and Yucatan. After quoting extensively from Josiah Priest's American Antiquities, the editorial reads thus: "If men in their researches into the history of this country, in noticing the mounds, fortifications, statues, architecture, implements of war, husbandry, and ornaments of silver, brass, etc., were to examine the Book of Mormon, their conjectures would be removed, their opinions altered, uncertainty and doubt would be changed into certainty and facts. And they would find that those things which they are anxiously prying into were matters of history unfolded in that book. They would find their conjectures were more than realized, that a great and a mighty people had inhabited this continent, that the arts and sciences and religion had prevailed to a very great extent, and that there was as great and mighty cities on this continent as in the continent of Asia. Babylon, Nineveh, nor any of the ruins of the Levant could boast of more perfect sculpture, better architectural designs, and more imperishable ruins than are found on this continent. Stevens and Catherwood's researches in Central America abundantly testify of this thing. The stupendous ruins, the elegant sculpture, and the magnificence of the ruins of Guatemala and other cities corroborate this statement and show that a great and mighty people, men of great minds, clear intellect, bright genius, and comprehensive designs, inhabited this continent. Their plans speak of their greatness. The Book of Mormon unfolds their history. So again, this editorial makes clear that the early saints embraced all evidence of the Book of Mormon, regardless whether it came from North America or South America. So how can we suggest that the core area of the Book of Mormon is in Mesoamerica and relegate the North American stuff to the periphery? Well, let's take a look at Joseph's statements that are typically used by proponents of the Heartland theory to see if they can be accommodated by the Hinterland hypothesis. Let's start with Zelph. The version of the Zelph story used by proponents of the Heartland theory relies on the history of the church as its source, which is problematic because it's merely a composite created by piecing together a number of different accounts. There are actually 6 primary source accounts of the moment when they discovered the Zelph ruins, none of which are Joseph's. The basic story goes something like this, for those of you who may not be familiar with it. While on Zion's Camp March in June of 1834, some men dug into a large mound and found a skeleton a foot or two below the surface. Joseph was either there when it happened, or he came later, perhaps even the next day. And there he proclaimed that the skeleton was that of a righteous Lamanite named Zelph, who served under the command of a chief or a king named Onondagas, who was known from the eastern seat of the Rocky Mountains. He had been killed in battle, evidenced by the arrowhead found lodged in his ribcage. But who exactly the battle was with is unclear. May have been Nephite versus Lamanite, may have been Lamanite versus Lamanite. The different accounts differ in the details. That detail and many others, for that matter. Now, although Joseph himself never mentioned Zelph in any of his personal writings, he did actually write a letter, or more precisely, he dictated a letter to Emma the next day. It was actually penned by James Mulholland and then signed by Joseph. In the letter, he mentions the satisfaction he felt while, quote, wandering over the plains of the Nephites, recounting occasionally the history of the Book of Mormon, roving over the mounds of that once beloved people, picking up their skulls and their bones as proof of its divine authenticity. To proponents of the Heartland theory, this is pretty open and shut. Joseph makes it plain that this was Nephite territory. Mesoamerican proponents, on the other hand, have suggested that perhaps Joseph was simply conjecturing or sharing his opinion rather than declaring this information to be received by revelation. I believe the Hinterland hypothesis can reconcile a Mesoamerican setting for the Book of Mormon while accepting Joseph's statements as revelatory. How so? Well, the individuals and geographic features that are named in these accounts are nowhere to be found in the text of the Book of Mormon. They're external to its history. There is no Zelph in the Book of Mormon. There's no Onondagas. There are no plains of the Nephites. As the Apostle John A. Widtsoe explained, Zelph probably dated from a later time when the Nephites and Lamanites had been somewhat dispersed and had wandered over the country. Likewise, the plains of the Nephites are never mentioned in the Book of Mormon. To be sure, there are plains mentioned in the Book of Mormon, between the cities of the Bountiful and Mulek, for example, or the plains of Nephihah mentioned in Alma 62. But the general term plains of the Nephites is absent from the Book of Mormon, and because there are multiple plains attested to in the text, the general phrase plains of the Nephites is too vague to be of any use in helping to pinpoint it in a real-world geography. Even the Jaredites we read of had plains of Heshlan and the plains of Agosh, but significantly never just the plains of the Jaredites. Plains in the text of the Book of Mormon are always attached to a specific city. Those in Joseph's letter to Emma are not. A few years later, after the Zelph incident, Joseph led a number of expeditions up to Daviess County, Missouri, to survey potential settlement locations for the saints. On May 19th of 1838, George Robinson, who was serving as the general church recorder and clerk for the first presidency at the time, recorded in the scriptory book this: the next morning we struck our tents and marched across the Grand River at the mouth of Honey Creek at a place called Nelson's Ferry. We next kept up the river, mostly in the timber, for 10 miles until we came to Colonel Lyman White's, who lives at the foot of Tower Hill, appropriated by President Smith in consequences of the remains of an old Nephitish altar and tower where we camped for the Sabbath. Now, the history of the church account of this mistakenly refers to this as a Nephite tower, whereas the original source material calls it a Nephitish altar. What's the difference? I don't know. I really don't. We can only speculate. We do find the term Lamanitish twice in the Book of Mormon, always in reference to Lamanite servants, to royalty. But the term Nephitish never appears. And in fact, as far as I know, this is the only time anything has ever been described as being Nephitish. So again, as for Joseph's description of the altar, some have suggested that He was just speculating. And they rely on Joseph's own oft-interpreted statement, which is certainly true, that a prophet is only a prophet when he's acting as such. But what if he actually was acting as such in this instance? What if it was revelation? Does that require that Tower Hill in Missouri was the location of a known Book of Mormon city? No, not at all. Tower Hill, or Joseph does not link the altar to any named Nephite city. The only city in the Book of Mormon that actually has a specific altar attached to it, there's a passing reference to one in the city of Sidon, after Alma has done some missionary work there. And that's the only one that specifically tells us it has an altar. So again, he's just sort of generalizing to it being Nephitish. So according to the Hinterland hypothesis, this Nephitish altar would have been built by the migrant Nephites of Alma 63, or what I think more likely by their descendants many generations later. Joseph's statement then can be considered revelatory without precluding a Mesoamerican setting for the Book of Mormon, and without requiring a North American setting either. Let's turn our attention now to the Cumorah question. If any specific Book of Mormon site is known, it must be the Hill Cumorah, right? I mean, we know that Moroni buried the plates there anciently and that Joseph Smith dug them up, so it's kind of a slam dunk for the Heartland proponents. But to be clear, Moroni never says that he buried the plates in Cumorah or that he was going to bury the plates in Cumorah. And there are no first-hand accounts that indicate Joseph Smith ever referred to the hill in New York by the name Cumorah. In fact, in his own history, he refers it to as a hill of considerable size. The way I explain it to my students at BYU is that the hill in New York is no more the Cumorah of the Book of Mormon than Bountiful, Utah is the Bountiful of the Book of Mormon. Right? It was named in honor of it, but is not one and the same with it. Now, a careful reading of Mormon chapter 6, verse 6, I think makes it clear that the plates that became the Book of Mormon were not buried in Cumorah. And I encourage all of you to read and reread Mormon chapter 6, verse 6 until you realize that I'm right. It says this: "It came to pass, then when we had gathered in all our people in one to the land of Cumorah, behold, I, Mormon, began to be old, and knowing it to be the last struggle of my people, and having been commanded of the Lord that I should not suffer the records which have been handed down by our fathers, which were sacred, to fall into the hands of the Lamanites, for the Lamanites would destroy them. Therefore I made this record," meaning the plates of Nephi that would become the Book of Mormon, "I made this record out of the plates of Nephi, and hid up in Cumorah, the hill Cumorah, all the records which had been entrusted to me by the hand of the Lord, save it were these few plates, which I give unto my son Moroni." Why doesn't he bury those plates in Cumorah and give them to Moroni? It's not just because he wanted Moroni to finish it up. The key factor is that he was worried that Cumorah was being overrun by Lamanites. In fact, a few years earlier, when the Nephites were being pushed northwards towards Cumorah in their never-ending battles with the Lamanites, Mormon informs us that I, Mormon, seeing that the Lamanites were about to overthrow the land, therefore I did go to the hill Shem, that was the previous repository, and I did take up all the records which Amram had hid up unto the Lord. Why did he do that? Because the Lamanites were about to overthrow the land. Now this is actually contrary to Amram's instructions. Amram said, "When you're about 24 years old, I would that you should remember the things which you have observed concerning this people. And when you're of that age, go to the land Antum, unto a hill which shall be called Shem, and there have I deposited unto the Lord all the sacred engravings concerning this people. And behold, ye shall take the plates of Nephi unto yourself, and the remainder ye shall leave in the place where they are." So he's specifically commanding him not to take all the records. But he does, because that area is being overrun by Lamanites. He says, "And ye shall engrave on the plates of Nephi all the things that you have observed concerning this people." And so again, he took the plates, all the plates out of Shem, because he was concerned that it was being overrun by Lamanites. And that's the exact same language he's using in Mormon chapter 6, verse 6, when he says, "I can't let these records fall into the hands of the Lamanites." So he buries all of the plates in Cumorah except for the plates that he gives to Moroni. Then what does Moroni do with them? In Mormon 8, which is written by Moroni, Moroni laments the destruction of his people at Cumorah, and he speaks only vaguely of his plan to hide up the records in the earth, a comment he made more than 20 years before actually burying them. And then in Moroni 1, written many years later, he states, "I wander whithersoever I can for the safety of my own life." In other words, he is long gone from Cumorah. He also makes the interesting comment that the Lamanites continue to put to death any Nephite that will not deny the Christ, making it clear that not all Nephites had been destroyed at the time of the final battle. As Nibley explains, to destroy means to wreck the structure, not to annihilate the component parts. The Jews, for example, have been destroyed from generation to generation, according to 2 Nephi 25. And you can almost go through the alphabet of who's destroyed the Jews, right? The Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Chaldeans, I don't know. I don't do Israelite history. But anyways, so where were these remnant Nephites that the Lamanites were putting to death? They must have been north of Cumorah, because we read in Mormon 8:2 that after the great and tremendous battle at Cumorah, behold, the Nephites who had escaped into the country southward were hunted by the Lamanites until they were all destroyed. So, by implication, the only Nephites that are left are those that are northward of Cumorah, likely in colonies that had been established centuries prior. Moving on to the New Jerusalem and concepts of this land or this country. The Lord revealed through the prophet Joseph Smith that the New Jerusalem will be built in Jackson County, Missouri. And the Book of Mormon explicitly states that it should be built upon this land, which proponents of the Heartland theory have taken to mean that the core area of the Book of Mormon must have been located in North America. However, Matt Roper has compiled literally dozens of statements from Joseph Smith and his contemporaries that make it abundantly clear that the expressions this land, this country, this continent, etc., are used to refer to the entire Western Hemisphere. But what about the, let's see, where am I at? Sorry. The quote we read earlier, for example, from the Times and Seasons, referred to both this country and this continent in referring to both the North American and the Mesoamerican evidence in the same breath. But what about the prophecies and promises about the mighty Gentile nation? Surely that means the United States of America. But statements by contemporaries of Joseph Smith make it clear that the teaching was that the whole of America was the land of promise. For example, Brigham Young, in August of 1852, said, "The land of Joseph is the land of Zion. It takes North and South America to make the land of Joseph." George J. Adams, an ardent believer in the Book of Mormon, wrote in 1844, "We come now to inquire, where has the seed of Joseph gone to? If they had taken up their residence in any part of what is technically called the Old World, would not history have informed us of the fact? There is no place except North and South America which they could have gone, if the Old World furnishes no trace of them. The continent of America is the only place where the prophecies concerning Joseph and his seed could be fulfilled." And yet another example, we have a written debate between a pair of elders named Wharton and Appleby and a critic named Amos Wickersham in 1843. Elder Appleby declares that his opponent Wickersham had said, "There are ruins known to exist in Central America. The land," he says, he says that I said belonged to Ephraim, etc. But I contend that it is North and South America, both, that includes the promised land to the branches of Joseph." The early saints understood that the whole continent was the promised land, not just the United States. The assertion that the United States alone is a land of promise is actually a fairly modern construct. I'm afraid that we suffer from presentism in this regard. Presentism is when it's the uncritical adherence to present-day attitudes, especially the tendency to interpret past events in terms of modern values and concepts. So we look at things that people did 100 years ago, and we judge them by today's standards, and you just can't do that. Now, the United States of our day is not the same as it was in Joseph Smith's day. When the Book of Mormon came forth in 1830, there were only 24 states. Does that mean the 26 states that have been added since then are outside the scope of the prophecies of promises? And it may be worth noting that when the Book of Mormon came forth, this was all Mexico, here in Utah. So, bienvenidos, right? Now, along those lines, the saints came to Utah in 1847 when it was still part of Mexico, but they didn't become a state until 1896. Were they cut off from the prophecies and promises for nearly 50 years? And who's to say we don't take over the rest of Mexico or even Canada in our quest to eradicate the twin relics of barbarism, ice hockey and soccer? They lure our children away from the divinely inspired sports of basketball and football. All joking aside, the point I'm trying to make is that borders change over time, but God's promises don't. The prophecies and promises given in the Book of Mormon to those that inhabit the Promised Land are extended to all. Now, one perhaps unanswerable question, but one I think needs to be considered, is regarding the faithfulness of those migrants that left in Alma 63. The Lamanite Wars had only recently ended, and many, it says, had become hardened because of the exceedingly great length of the war between the Nephites and the Lamanites. These people had grown tired of endless conflict with the Lamanites and were likely seeking to put some distance between them and their aggressors to the south. The further, the better. The timing was good, by the way. The window of peace was short-lived, a few years at best. Not long after they left, some Nephite dissenters joined with the Lamanites, and another large battle ensued in Nephite territory. But why does this question even matter? Well, when looking for evidence of Nephite colonies, we need to ask ourselves if they had been practicing normative Nephite religion, or if they had been fully acculturated into native beliefs and practices. Had they gone apostate? Alma 63 makes no mention of them taking records or being led by righteous individuals. I think it plausible, if not likely, that their Mesoamerican identity would have been more dominant than their Nephite affiliation. As an aside, my personal view is that the Nephites lived among the larger population, but were not one and the same with it, just as we Latter-day Saints are entrenched within the cultures where we live, but we maintain kind of a subculture identity as Latter-day Saints. But let's suppose you were to take a bunch of inactive Mormons, those who are sort of culturally Mormon, raised Mormon, but have no interest in actually practicing it, and you take a group of them and you drop them into, I don't know, China. Would they be perceived as an American colony or as a Mormon colony? If they brought no scriptures or church literature with them at all and were completely cut off from the main body of the saints, within a generation or two, any remnant Mormon identity would likely be completely lost. So it may have been with these northward settling Nephites. On the other hand, they may have ended up like those in the Mormon colonies of Mexico, who remained faithful despite living in the hinterlands 1,000 miles away from the core of the church. As something of an aside, but I think relevant to the present discussion, I spent a summer in the Mormon colonies as an undergraduate doing some linguistic anthropological work studying bilingualism there. And I'm always surprised at how many members of the church have never even heard of the colonies. They got a little bit of press a couple years ago during the election cycle because Romney's heritage is from there. But a lot of people have just never even heard of them. Now, we live in an information age, and the colonies were only established a little over 100 years ago, and yet there are still people that have never heard of them. And so I think by analogy, if we think about the Nephites living after the time of Christ, it's unsurprising that many of them may have known little to nothing about these northward bound colonists. All right, with the hinterland hypothesis, the question naturally arises as to whether or not any evidence for movement from Mesoamerica to North America exists, and there certainly is. The evidence suggests that Mesoamerican cultural influence spread primarily northward, beginning long before the Nephites ever set foot in the New World, and continuing through the late post-classic period, meaning the trails were blazed long before the Book of Mormon era and continue to be used long after Moroni sealed up the record. The evidence for movement northward is incremental, slowly radiating outward over generations. What type of evidence is there? All kinds. Genetic, linguistic, botanical, ideological, archaeological, it's all there. Tyler Livingston, who's affiliated with FAIR here, recently compiled and published an article with the Book of Mormon Archaeological Forum that gives a nice overview of each of these different bodies of evidence. But because of time constraints here, I'm only going to share one or two examples from each of these areas of research. Let's begin with the genetic evidence. In 2003, a study was done that compared the DNA of the Ohio Hopewell with 50 different indigenous populations from both North and Central America, and they found Central American and even South American markers. This, of course, demonstrates that the interaction between the two regions involved more than just the trading of goods and ideas. For genetic markers to be so prevalent, it is likely that there was a significant amount of procreation, more than is likely from just the occasional Mesoamerican merchant passing through town. Linguistic data compiled by Brian Stubbs and supported by other linguists demonstrates that Uto-Aztecan spread from Mexico into North America, primarily the American Southwest. But as was mentioned previously, the northward influence was often incremental, meaning we see clear influence from central Mexico to northern Mexico, then from northern Mexico into the American Southwest, and then from the American Southwest onward, etc. But there's a filtering or diluting of some of these cultural traits, but they are nevertheless traceable. For example, non-LDS scholar Robert L. Hall recently published in the Oxford Handbook of North American Archaeology, which is a reputable source, anything by Oxford is good. He said that the Cherokee word for corn, selu, is cognate with the Nahuatl word for corn, silo. As for botanical evidence, the main staple food of Mesoamerica was corn. As non-LDS scholar Timothy Pocketot noted in his 2004 book, Ancient Cahokia and the Mississippians, which is published by Cambridge University Press, again a reputable source, Mesoamerican corn reached eastern North America by approximately 200 BC. Ideologically and culturally, there are a number of fascinating commonalities pointed out by Robert L. Hall in his previously mentioned Oxford chapter, which is entitled Some Commonalities Linking North America and Mesoamerica. He notes the importance of the sweat bath, which is variously associated with birth, renewal, and spiritual cleansing that is found from as far south as Guatemala and across North America, from Alaska in the northwest to Newfoundland in the northeast. Another cultural commonality is the importance of competitive sports, specifically the ball game. Although the specific game varied from culture to culture, they shared the overarching concept of team sports played with a ball. There are also many commonalities regarding their mourning rites and their rituals of sacrifice. For example, there's a particular rite among both Aztec and Great Plains Indians wherein warriors would be tethered to a stone or pole and required to fight enemies with only a wooden paddle. And now the tethered warrior was not likely to survive. This was a sacrificial rite. Another common sacrificial rite was that of a scaffold sacrifice, wherein the victim would be tied standing upright with their arms and legs spread out, and then they would be shot with arrows. These few examples we need to suffice because of time. But something that non-archaeologists may not understand is that there is frustrating little communication between Mesoamericanists and North America, Mesoamericanists and North American archaeologists, and same thing between Mesoamericanists and South American archaeologists. We just don't talk to each other, and that seems strange to people outside of the field, but it's just how it is. In fact, in 2008, there was an article in American Antiquity, which is one of the top-tier journals of our field, and the authors lamented, archaeologists in the southeastern United States and Mexico seldom communicate with each other. Basic comparisons of site data, settlement, subsistence, or other cultural systems from one region to the other are rarely attempted, even around the Gulf where it would be easy. Point being, there's a lot that we still don't know. In conclusion, I'd like to restate that my hope with this paper was that I might be able to reconcile somewhat the statements made by the prophet Joseph Smith concerning Nephites and Lamanites with what the best archaeological evidence tells us about where the Book of Mormon likely took place. I've attempted to respectfully show that the Hinterland hypothesis can account for Joseph's inspired statements while keeping the core narrative of the Book of Mormon in Mesoamerica. Evidence from within the Book of Mormon and from real-world archaeology demonstrates the movement of peoples and ideas from Mesoamerica to North America. But to reiterate, the Church has no official position on such matters. Let's not let questions of where the Book of Mormon took place overpower the actual message of the book, that Jesus is the Christ and the prophecies and promises that are extended to all who come unto him. Thank you. I'm guessing there are questions. I only take easy questions, by the way. I'm sorry, what was that? South. She asked where the Book of Mormon history was, and I said south. So, all right. Since wine and drunkenness is prominent in stories in the books of Mosiah and Alma, and inferred in the Book of Ether, is there evidence of fermented beverages among the Heartland culture, like there is for Central American cultures during the Book of Mormon times? That's a good question. I don't know. I'm a Mesoamericanist. I don't know what to tell you. All right. Let's see. Joseph Smith described the Book of Mormon as the most correct book on earth. I am a geographer, accept distances and directions mentioned there to support the Heartland. Let's see. Basically, from what I understand, do the distances and directions mentioned there support the Heartland proposal, and what do you think of Baja Peninsula? The Baja model is problematic just because there just aren't the population sizes there. I'm friends with people archaeologists that work down there, and we can, just to give you an example, one of my friends recently found a little settlement next to the coast, and I think there was something like 8 to 10 houses there, and he was very excited about that. But that was the whole settlement, and if we can find 8 to 10 houses, there's no way that tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people are just simply going to disappear. As for the distances, I mean, that is one thing to kind of recommend the Baja model, but the problem is the culture just is not there. See, do you see Moroni's travel from Mesoamerica to the hill in New York? Is that reasonable? Yeah, in fact, there was a shipwrecked sailor named David Ingram in the mid-16th century, so the mid-1500s. He got shipwrecked off the coast of the Yucatan, and he walked up to Nova Scotia in 11 months. Now, if some Englishman, if there's anybody here from England, I apologize, some Englishman that doesn't know the language or the culture or what berries they can eat without dying can make it in 11 months, I've got no problem with Moroni making it there in 36 years. The final battle at Cumorah was in 382? 385. And then he buries the plates. He says it's been more than 420 years since he buried them. So he's got about 36 years to wander. How am I doing all the time, by the way?
You're doing good.
Okay. Let's see. Okay. There's another example of a couple of Spaniards that were shipwrecked, and they walked all the way to the tip of Florida, which is about the same distance and about the same amount of time. Let's see. So can we assume no Book of Mormon peoples moved as far north as Canada? It's the same continent. Why is Canada never included in the prophecies for the New World? I think that with my Hinterland hypothesis, I think those prophecies and promises would extend up there. The point I'm trying to make is we've got these, 15 to 20,000 Nephites that go northward in 50 BC, and you never hear from them again. That's a lot of time to spread out, to get around. And so I have no problem with, the first peoples of Canada being part of that as well. What do I do with the account of a stranger with a knapsack headed for Cumorah, whom Joseph and others saw from a wagon? Well, one problem is the accounts are secondhand, and the others, he doesn't specify where Cumorah is. We just sort of assume that he was heading for the hill in New York, but he never says, I'm heading to Cumorah in New York. For all we know, he was on a very long journey down south. Could Haygoff and his colonists, and maybe others later, have colonized the Mississippi drainage area and started or added to the Adena and Hopewell culture? Could Moroni have been living with them in the last years of his life? The first question, I think certainly. We know that Haygoff, it says, launched into the West Sea, but we don't even know where the West Sea is, to be frank. I've seen some models that suggest that the Gulf of Mexico is the West Sea. And if you were to leave there and go north, that would take you straight into the Mississippi. Now, as far as Moroni living with them in the last years of his life, if you read kind of the final chapters of his life, it's kind of depressing. He talks about how he has nowhere to go. And so I get the sense, maybe he did spend some time with them again. 36 years is a long time. And there's traditions in Manti, for example, that he dedicated the temple site. I mean, and by tradition, I mean it's in the dedicatory prayer. So it's certainly possible, but it was probably in the midst of those final years, of those 36 years, but not the final years. How do we know how the current Hill Cumorah was so named? I think the first, somebody can correct me on this, was it David Whitmer? Is the earliest account we have of somebody calling it Cumorah, but I don't know the dates on that, I'm sorry. So that's the best answer I can give. There seems to be pictographic and more solid evidence of trades from Mesoamerica coming into the desert Southwest. This seems to support your hypothesis. Yeah, there's undisputed evidence between Mesoamerica and the Southwest. I mean, it's just not even questioned anymore. Even architecturally, they're similar. When you get up as far north as like Paquime in Chihuahua, Mexico, even the ball court is shaped exactly the same as you see in all the Mesoamerican cultures, and that's just right across the border from the other southwestern cultures. But yeah, I think the motifs on the pottery are very supportive of that. And Robert Hall in his Oxford book actually points that out. Well, not tying it in the Book of Mormon, but from Mesoamerica to the southwest. What happened to the arrowhead that killed Zelph? Has it been studied? Even the early accounts differ. There are 3 different accounts of who got the arrowhead. There is an arrowhead in the archives in Salt Lake City that traditionally had been associated with Zelph, but if you do a morphological examination of it, it's actually a Great Basin point, so it's from the Salt Lake area. And so somebody may have just was trying to fill a void there and put that arrowhead in there, and then later somebody said, oh, that was the arrowhead that killed him. But at one point it was said to be in the possession of Brigham Young. At another point, Heber C. was supposedly had it, and then I think 2 others actually beyond that. But from Yeah, all we have is the replica, basically. You mentioned your research is published in Book of Mormon Archaeology. How do we find that? It's not online. I have an article that I co-published with Brant Gardner in the Interpreter Journal. It was actually the Volume 1, Number 2. It's called The Cultural Context of Nephite Apostasy. And there we look at how basically if you take normative Nephite religion and you mix it with Mesoamerican religion, you get what looks like apostate Nephite religion. It's a great article. And then I also published in the Studies in the Bible and Antiquity, which sounds like it's outside of my field, but I talk about hierophanies and theophanies and contrast those in the Old World with those of the New World. And that's in Volume 3, I believe, of the Studies in the Bible and Antiquity. And then I've got more things coming out, but I'm just sort of getting started in my career. There's a bunch of YouTube videos of me speaking at conferences like this that you could probably track down. Let's see. Have any of the evidences presented in Ethan Smith's view of the Hebrews held up over time? The view of the Hebrews is interesting. John Gee actually did a good article on this, or a chapter. I think it was called The Wrong Kind of Book. And he talks about how the things that basically the view that Ethan Smith has of the indigenous people, we're talking about moccasins and canoes and teepees and things like that. Those are things that are never mentioned in the Book of Mormon. So if Joseph Smith were writing in his day, those are the types of things he probably would have been writing about. So Ethan Smith's view of the Hebrews is very much informed by the perceptions of his immediate area, and they fall flat. Do I still have time? Okay. Alex Baugh of BYU suggests that the term Nephitish is merely a 19th century Mormon synonym for American Indians, the reasoning being that the Indians were descended from Nephites. Comments? Well, yeah, I think that fits in nicely with my hypothesis. In fact, I've talked to Alex about it, and he got very excited, and he said he thinks that makes perfect sense. And so they were, in fact, Nephites, but they were Nephites that were external to the text of the Book of Mormon. They're part of that 99.9% that Jacob through Moroni couldn't talk about because there wasn't room on the plates.
That's it.
Okay. Thank you.